In this video, we take a closer look at our church's windows and the important job of maintaining and conserving them, the challenges they can present, and the common well-intentioned cleaning mistakes to avoid at all costs. Lizzie Hipsley Cox is a qualified conservator of architectural stained glass. She explains some of the challenges involved in conserving our historic windows.
Yeah, stained glass is a challenging thing to conserve. It's part of the historic fabric of the building, part of the building envelope, so it serves a function, and anything in a building that serves a function has wear and tear. So for windows, they're a weather barrier, they have water on the exterior surface and wind loading. Stained glass, for people who don't know, is lots of fragments of glass that are cut into shapes and held together in a lead matrix. So lots of individual cames of lead that has been extruded or cast into a certain shape to accommodate the glass in between in strips, and those are all soldered together and waterproof to make a window. The more detailed versions of stained glass windows will also have painted layers and sometimes be treated with acid or sandblasting to have different decorative effects. So they're all very bespoke, and for conservation that means that you'll have different challenges specific to the context of your window. There's lots of different challenges depending on the age of a stained glass window, but not necessarily age isn't necessarily an indication that the job will be more difficult. Quite a lot of modern stained glass windows, so from the 21st century and the 20th century, were quite experimental, moving away from a lot of the traditional techniques of stained glass, which were obviously developed in the Middle Ages and revived in the Victorian period quite accurately, so very traditional use of the materials. But the 20th century saw quite a lot of experimentation with resins and concrete. So those can be really challenging projects to work on as well. And also, the older the window, the more likely it is that it's been worked on by somebody else in the past. And quite often as conservators, we're not just looking at the historic fabric, we're also looking at how do we protect and preserve the interventions that have come since. So if a window is particularly ancient, it could have had 3 or 4 different generations of intervention from 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and it's really important before you start a project to look really closely at your window and identify which bits date from which historical period, and assess the significance as well of each of those interventions.
As well as offering advice on conservation, Lizzie also works on new designs and commissions from her studio in Cumbria.
Generally, a project will start when a church identifies a need for some repair. So the people living with the church will recognise that there's a problem, maybe a leak in the window or some bowing of the lead matrix if it's distorted. And they might report that to their architect. Their inspecting architects will also be inspecting the building regularly, and the quinquennial, the 5-yearly inspection, will include stained glass. And if they're confident in diagnosing any problems with stained glass, they might write that up in the quinquennial themselves and leave that with the PCC to get in touch with a stained glass repair or conservation practitioner. But also quite often a conservator like myself would be called by the PCC directly to report on any concerns expressed by the parish or by their inspecting architect. And a lot of my job involves going to visit, sometimes with the architect or sometimes just to go and have a closer investigation of any problems that are reported, but also to have a look and do a sort of thorough MOT of the windows and plan whether or not it needs repair. Obviously, the important aspect of finance and budget comes into it. So a church might have a problem with one window, but use that as an opportunity to say, oh, we'll have an inspection of every window in the church, perhaps making a maintenance plan or a conservation plan for how they'll go forward in looking after the windows in the next 5 or 10 years' time. Finance is an issue for small parish churches, and often in Cumbria particularly it's the case that the stained glass is Victorian and very elaborate and very expensive, and came from a time when there was a particular amount of wealth in that village, which may since have gone. A village might be half the size it was in the 19th century, meaning that the budget just isn't there to have the expensive reports and the conservation work that need doing. So part of my job is also helping with grant applications if a parish is struggling with the cost of the upkeep of stained glass windows. But I tend to really encourage parishes to come for information about their windows before it becomes a major problem. So it's quite a good idea to be prepared, maybe not every 5 years when you have your quinquennial inspection, but maybe every 10 years think about having a specialist come and do a general health check of the condition of the windows, because it might well be that some small repairs in the short term will save a much bigger project having to occur in the future.
Some good advice on planning and being prepared to look after our beautiful windows. And Cumbria does have some stunning treasures if you know where to find them.
Cumbria has a lot of stained glass windows that are real kind of hidden gems. So whereas other counties are quite renowned for having interesting stained glass, for Cumbria you've got to look a little bit in more depth. But there are some really nice examples of medieval glass. You'll find them in Cartmel Priory. It's mostly like small fragments that have been recited in different, it's a very English tradition of making sort of mosaic windows where tiny pieces of glass from all different windows in the church are all combined and put together in one window. That's the case in Cartmel with quite a few of their bits of medieval glass from who knows where. It's really interesting, and there's lots still to be researched about those windows. Another very famous, and I take all my visitors that come and see me up in Cumbria to visit the stained glass in Brampton in St Martin's Church. So the church is very famous for having been designed by Philip Webb. St Martin's in Brampton has got some very special windows. It's a wonderful scheme entirely made by the Morris & Co firm, so designed by Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. And it's actually, the windows were not all commissioned at once. They were actually made, I think, almost chronologically going clockwise around the church, if I remember correctly. So you can see the evolution of the style of one firm, which makes it fascinating. And they were really at the forefront of the redesigning and reimagining stained glass for the 19th century. So that's a fantastic example of Cumbrian stained glass. And it's quite famous, but there's also a couple of other very nice windows by the same firm. In fact, we're about to start working on a window from a church over towards the Solway called Kirkbampton at St Peter's, and they just have a very small amount of Morris & Co stained glass because they've got a very small east window, but it's their whole east window. It's a triple light of minstrel angels with Christ triumphant in the centre at the top. And it's interesting because it was the first window that the firm made in Cumbria, so it's in the early 1860s that it was designed and made. And with many of the Morris & Co windows, a design would have been reused several times, so you might have a very nice example of a certain design, but it might have been the 5th or 6th time they've used it. Whereas in Kirkbampton, they've got 2 of the figures that were designed specifically for that place, which is quite special. And if you know Kirkbampton, it's not a big village, so it's very interesting that they had this big, important firm. But sadly, that window was in a really poor condition. The paint layers were very badly deteriorated, very fragile on the surface. As it was one of their earlier windows, there was some sort of teething problems with the practices in the studio, and they hadn't quite figured out exactly how to do it. But at first the glass looked fine, so they'd have been leaded up, made into a window and shipped up to Cumbria and installed. But at that point, once it's exposed to the conditions, the external conditions and then the condensation, and that church is a particularly damp church, the condensation is formed on the surface and has caused quite a lot of bad erosion of the paint layers, and it's quite sad to see. You can only just make out the figures' faces. If you look at it very carefully, very close up, there's ghost lines of all the details of the eyes, but the actual paint has completely washed away. So we're starting a conservation project on that window, which has been fortunately funded partly by the local community and then partly by some grants. So that window is going to be removed in the coming few weeks and conserved and preserved for the future. So I really recommend visiting that church if you haven't already.
So how can we help look after these hidden gems of beauty and conserve them for future generations?
Yeah, it's most important if you're thinking my windows need cleaning. Stop right there, make sure you contact somebody who is experienced in cleaning stained glass windows. The most important thing is to be informed from the start of a project, so you know how important the window is, how likely it is, what era it dates from will tell you how likely it is that it will have an unstable paint layer on the surface or be structurally unsound as well. So it's very important to get somebody who's used to working with windows and can demonstrate that experience to have a look for you first, and ideally for them to undertake the cleaning as well if it needs to be done. Generally with a church's stained glass windows, a specialist like myself would recommend very, very little interaction from a parish with the window. At the very most, I'd say feather duster to cobwebs, but not allowing that feather duster to touch the surface of the window, because not many people know that even Victorian windows can be quite badly deteriorated on the interior surface. So coloured stained glass, such as a Victorian window with a pictorial scene on, will have a vitreous or enamel paint applied to the surface when it was created. And during the rediscovery in the Victorian Gothic revival of these techniques, there was quite a lot of kind of testing different compositions of paint, different temperatures in the kiln. It was also produced on a big scale, which means that quite a lot of 19th century windows have a serious problem with ill-fired paints on the surface, which can, over time, with the condensation forming on the window, result in paint loss of the trace lines, the shapes around the faces and some of the shading with sort of water on the surface. It can become very fragile, either flaky or it can be powdery, and even the lightest touch with a feather duster could actually dislodge that and remove that paint forever. So I'd always recommend extreme caution until you've had a specialist that can come and check the paint layers and say whether or not they're stable. Many times the case will be that they're very well fired, really strongly adhered to the glass and good for another few hundred years, and you'll be okay to clean. But I would also point out that many of these windows are not at easy reach of the average person. Most of them will require access, and I wouldn't recommend that anybody attempt to access and clean their windows by ladder on their own. I'd always make sure that you've got a specialist there that's used to working from height. But it's a very tempting thing to do, and I think that's one of the things we see quite a lot as conservators, is very well-intentioned over-cleaning, but sadly the results could be quite catastrophic if there are fragile paint layers on the surface. Oh, it's a lovely feeling when you think of yourself as part of a continuum of people who've been caring for and appreciating these really special historic places. I like looking out for if workmen in the past might have left their name written somewhere high on a windowsill that no one's going to see. And it's quite common as well if you have a lead sill or tucked away somewhere into a little cavity in the stonework, you'll find a piece of newspaper from the era when the window was installed, or somebody's names, and you can even see fingerprints up in high places as well. And it's nice to be part of that continual process. It's not a window that's just a monument that's unchanging. It's evolved over the years, and people have added bits and people have appreciated it in completely different ways through the years. And I think now's quite a good time if we're really appreciating the effort and the artistry and things that have gone into our churches. And it's great to just spend my days surrounded by such beautiful windows and other church interiors, and yeah, I'm very lucky.
But there are some secrets our windows may never tell us.
Lots of people will have different signatures or tags. If you're making a new stained glass window, you've often got a sign or a symbol, and you can find a catalogue that's got all the different symbols of stained glass artists over the years. But we don't normally tell people what they are. We just put them there and leave them for avid stained glass fans to find.
For more information, you can visit our website at www.ctfc.org.uk.